Hello, welcome to Chapter 14, Autonomic Nervous System. This is Part 3 of the Autonomic Nervous System, and this one we're going to talk about neurotransmitters. So we'll just make sure our pen works. It does. So we are in the peripheral nervous system. When we're looking at the entire nervous system, we can break it up into two major parts: central nervous system, peripheral nervous system. And then in the peripheral nervous system, you can have two divisions: the sensory afferent division, that's inflow or sensory information flowing from the periphery into the peripheral nervous system and then into the central nervous system. The other branch, major branch of the peripheral nervous system is the motor efferent division. That's where information, that's outflow, so information in the form of action potentials and axons and neurons flows out from the central nervous system into the peripheral nervous system via the motor efferent division. And then the motor efferent division you can break into two parts: the somatic nervous system. So I hope you remember, anytime you see somatic, you think skeletal muscle, skin, and joints. And then here's the autonomic nervous system that we're talking about in this video. And there's two branches in the autonomic nervous system: the sympathetic and parasympathetic branches or divisions. And for these videos, I abbreviate the sympathetic nervous system, or the sympathetic division, as the sympathetic nervous system, and the parasympathetic division as the parasympathetic nervous system. And this can get you can get confused. There's PNS for the parasympathetic, PNS for the peripheral. But whenever I'm talking about those two together, I'll spell out peripheral nervous system and parasympathetic nervous system. So in the last video, we looked at this cartoon, but let's just review it. This is actually, it says here, comparison of motor neurons in the somatic and autonomic nervous system, but I took away the somatic part of this cartoon. So we're just looking at the autonomic nervous system. So if you look here on the y-axis, you have the autonomic nervous system, and then you break that into parasympathetic and sympathetic. And then these are the neurons that you would see in those two divisions of the autonomic nervous system. So for example, here's the sympathetic nervous system. Here's the neuron from the sympathetic nervous system. Where would you find that cell body? The cell body of this neuron in the sympathetic nervous system. You'd find that in the lateral horn of the spinal cord. So that's where you'd find the cell body of the sympathetic neuron. And the dendrite, these are the dendrites, these things coming off the cell body. And then here's the axon with a lightly myelinated preganglionic axon. Here's the synapse between the preganglionic neuron, the lightly myelinated preganglionic neuron axon, synapsing with the postganglionic neuron with its non-myelinated postganglionic axon. The neurotransmitter that's used to communicate information from the preganglionic neuron to the postganglionic neuron is acetylcholine, and then the postganglionic neuron will release the neurotransmitter norepinephrine onto its target tissue. The effect of norepinephrine on target tissue could be stimulatory or inhibitory. So the positive sign means norepinephrine will stimulate that target. The negative sign means that norepinephrine will inhibit that target, and that depends on the receptor. So we're still in the top panel, that's the sympathetic nervous system. Sympathetic nervous system also has preganglionic neurons that go not to a ganglion to synapse with the postganglionic neuron, but rather the preganglionic neuron releases its neurotransmitter on this structure called the adrenal medulla. Well, the adrenal medulla of the adrenal gland, because outside of the adrenal gland is a cortex. So releases acetylcholine and to the adrenal medulla, the inside of the adrenal gland. And then those cells, they're called chromaffin cells, they release epinephrine and norepinephrine into the blood. And then those two neurotransmitters can travel all over the body and bind to different organs. So the sympathetic nervous system has really a diffuse effect. Whereas, on the other hand, the parasympathetic nervous system, so this bottom panel, releases its postganglionic neuron releases its neurotransmitter, in this case it's acetylcholine, on its target tissue specifically. The parasympathetic nervous system doesn't have a device where it can release its neurotransmitter into the blood, thus traveling all over the body. Okay, so neurotransmitters, we've talked about that. Acetylcholine, ACH, you can see acetylcholine in the autonomic nervous system is released from the preganglionic neuron of the sympathetic fibers. So remember, this top panel is sympathetic. That's what the neurons look like in the sympathetic nervous system. And then the bottom panel is the parasympathetic nervous system. But if just look at the word acetylcholine, acetylcholine is released from the axon terminal of all the preganglionic neurons in the sympathetic and the parasympathetic nervous system. But acetylcholine is also released from the postganglionic neuron axon onto the target tissue in the parasympathetic, but in the sympathetic nervous system, the neurotransmitter that's released from the postganglionic neuron onto the target tissue is norepinephrine. And I don't have it in this cartoon, but when acetylcholine binds to chromaffin cells in the adrenal medulla releases norepinephrine and epinephrine into the blood. If you are a neuron and you release acetylcholine, then you are a cholinergic fiber or a cholinergic axon. So remember, fibers and axons, the same thing. So cholinergic fibers release the neurotransmitter acetylcholine. All autonomic nervous system preganglionic axons or fibers release acetylcholine. We just talked about that. These guys are all preganglionic neurons, and their axon terminals release acetylcholine. All parasympathetic postganglionic axons release acetylcholine. So here's a postganglionic axon of the parasympathetic nervous system releasing acetylcholine, and then that acetylcholine will bind to its target tissue and cause an effect. The sympathetic nervous system fibers or axons are called adrenergic. And that seems kind of weird, right? Because it's epinephrine and norepinephrine. But it does make sense if you know that these adrenergic fibers come from adrenaline. So norepinephrine is also called noradrenaline. Epinephrine is also called adrenaline. And you've probably heard of that, like adrenaline junkies. Well, epinephrine, adrenaline, for our purposes, it's the same thing. So the fibers that release adrenaline, aka epinephrine, are called adrenergic fibers. So most, but not all, but most postganglionic axon, so we're here, postganglionic axon in the sympathetic nervous system release norepinephrine. This is the only place in the autonomic nervous system where norepinephrine is released onto a target. There's exceptions. Sympathetic postganglionic fibers will secrete acetylcholine for your sweat glands and some of your blood vessels and skeletal muscles. There's usually an exception to every rule, right? So let's take a look at this cartoon. Now we're going to talk about acetylcholine receptors. and norepinephrine and epinephrine receptors. So the things that those receptors are the proteins that bind the neurotransmitters, acetylcholine and norepinephrine. So in this cartoon, at the ganglion, so this is the sympathetic nervous system. Here's our preganglionic neuron axon releasing acetylcholine here, and the postganglionic neuron is going to bind acetylcholine. But now here's where we're getting some more detail. Acetylcholine in the sympathetic nervous system at the ganglion will bind to acetylcholine receptors called nicotinic receptors. So nicotinic receptors are located on the cell body of the postganglionic neuron. They will bind acetylcholine. And then a bunch of biochemistry happens. You get an action potential, more biochemistry down here at the axon terminal. And this postganglionic axon terminal will release norepinephrine, and norepinephrine will bind to adrenergic receptors on the target tissue. But now we're going to say that it's not just an adrenergic receptor. It can be an alpha adrenergic receptor or a beta adrenergic receptor. And then there's alpha 1 adrenergics, beta 1 adrenergics. I'm not sure how many, like maybe it goes to beta 3 now, beta 3 adrenergic receptors. But the point is, norepinephrine is a neurotransmitter that's secreted, and it has to bind to a receptor on the target, and those receptors can be really complicated. So that it would be an adrenergic receptor, but it could be an alpha adrenergic receptor, it could be a beta adrenergic receptor, and then there's sub-receptors within alpha and beta categories. In the sympathetic, we're still in the sympathetic nervous system, so we're in the top panel. Here's our preganglionic neuron releasing acetylcholine. Acetylcholine is looking for a receptor to bind, and it finds nicotinic receptors on chromaffin cells of the adrenal medulla, which is the inner part of the adrenal gland. And then those chromaffin cells, upon stimulation with acetylcholine, release epinephrine and norepinephrine. For the parasympathetic nervous system, in the ganglion, the preganglionic neuron will release acetylcholine. The cell body of the postganglionic neuron will also have nicotinic receptors to bind the acetylcholine. And then an action potential will fire. It'll travel down the postganglionic axon. Biochemistry happens. More acetylcholine is released from the postganglionic axon. And these little blue triangles are acetylcholine. They're looking for receptors to bind to. But instead of nicotinic receptors, they're going to find another type of acetylcholine receptor called a muscarinic receptor. So acetylcholine from the postganglionic axon of the parasympathetic nervous system will bind to muscarinic receptors, not nicotinic receptors. And these, like the axons that release acetylcholine, they're cholinergic fibers. If you bind acetylcholine, then you are called a cholinergic receptor. And there's two types of cholinergic receptors that we're going to talk about. It's probably subcategories too. But there's nicotinic receptors for acetylcholine and muscarinic receptors for acetylcholine. If you are acetylcholine and you bind a nicotinic receptor, you will always stimulate your target. If you are acetylcholine and you bind to a muscarinic receptor, you're mostly stimulatory as well, but not always. And then we talked about how we have number 2 down here, adrenergic receptors for norepinephrine. And then we talked about how you can have alpha and beta receptors. Okay, so we're still working off the same cartoon. Anything new on here? Oh, it just shows how, if you are acetylcholine and you're looking for a receptor, you can bind to a muscarinic receptor or a nicotinic receptor, but in the target organ, those muscarinic receptors for acetylcholine would be on targets like smooth muscle that lines the gut, glands, and cardiac muscle. So these muscarinic receptors, they're found on parasympathetic target organs. Mostly when acetylcholine binds to a muscarinic receptor on a target organ, mostly that's a stimulation event. So for example, smooth muscle of the GI tract. So if you are in a rest and digest situation, acetylcholine will flow from this parasympathetic nervous system, will bind to muscarinic receptors on smooth muscle cells in the gut, and they'll start working. So and then they'll move that the material that you just ate. Smooth muscle cells will contract and relax and move that material through the gut as part of the digestion process. Muscarinic receptors are found on cardiac muscle cells, and when acetylcholine binds to those muscarinic receptors on cardiac muscle cells, that's inhibitory, so you don't have as strong a heartbeat. Some sympathetic target organs have muscarinic receptors for acetylcholine, and that is when acetylcholine binds to the muscarinic receptors on a sweat gland, that's excitatory. So think about it. This is all the way you can always remember the sympathetic and parasympathetic events, is that if you are in a fight or flight situation, you start sweating. So sympathetic stimulation to your sweat glands would be a stimulatory event, an excitatory event to cause you to sweat. Now we're going to look at the adrenergic receptors. So adrenergic receptors include alpha and beta adrenergic receptors that will bind to adrenaline, aka epinephrine. There's two types of adrenergic receptors on the target organs, and then in this panel, this cartoon of all the target organs that could possibly have adrenergic receptors on them. There's alpha adrenergic receptors, and then within those alpha adrenergic receptors, there are subtypes, alpha 1 and alpha 2. There's beta adrenergic receptors, and there's 3 subtypes in your book, beta 1, 2, and 3. And then the effect that norepinephrine will have on the target depends on which subtype of the receptor the norepinephrine binds to. And you'll do a lot of adrenergic receptor physiology in 202. This is kind of an introduction. But let's look at this table for adrenergic receptors. So remember we said there's adrenergic receptors. They can be alpha or beta. Within the alpha receptors, there's alpha 1 and alpha 2. Within the beta adrenergic receptors, there's beta 1, 2, and 3. So, and these adrenergic receptors bind to norepinephrine and epinephrine if it's released by the adrenal medulla. Adrenergic receptors beta 1, the major location is in the heart. Beta 2, adrenergic receptor beta 2, the major location is in the lung. If you are epinephrine, your neurotransmitter, you're secreted on the heart, your epinephrine, you bind to this beta 1 adrenergic receptor. That's going to increase the heart rate and the strength of the heartbeat. And you'll do all of this receptor physiology with the heart and the lungs in 202, so talk more about it there. What about drugs, the effect of, well, I should say legal drugs? put legal right in there, the effects of legal drugs on the autonomic nervous system. A drug, I don't know if you've heard of this, it's called atropine. It's anti-cholinergic. So if it's anti-cholinergic, that means it's going to work against that cholinergic receptor. And specifically, atropine will block muscarinic receptors. So remember, muscarinic receptors are on all these target organs that receive the neurotransmitter acetylcholine from the parasympathetic nervous system. So you use atropine to prevent salivation during surgery, and when the doctor wants to dilate your pupils to examine the inside of your eye, you can use atropine. There's also this drug called neostigmine. It inhibits acetylcholine esterase, and if you remember from the neuromuscular junction we did skeletal system, acetylcholine esterase is an enzyme that breaks down acetylcholine. So if you inhibit an enzyme that breaks down acetylcholine, that means acetylcholine is going to stay active longer because it's not getting broken down. And they use neostigmine to treat this condition, myasthenia gravis, where you have impaired skeletal muscle activity. So let's look at the beta adrenergic blockers in the sympathetic nervous system. So beta blockers will block beta adrenergic receptors. If you block those receptors, you can slow the heart down. If you block beta 1, I don't know if any of you take beta blockers for anxiety-provoking situations. I've heard that professional musicians, like in orchestras and things like that, somebody told me that they'll take beta blockers to inhibit their anxiety. So there's beta blockers. There's also beta activators. So then you would activate the beta adrenergic receptor. And remember, these are in the sympathetic nervous system. So if you are activating a beta adrenergic receptor in the sympathetic nervous system, you're doing something to help you in a fight or flight situation. And that makes sense. You're going to, with beta activators, a drug that's called a beta activator, you're going to dilate your lung bronchioles. So those tubes that are in your lungs that let air in, that makes sense. If you're in a fight or flight situation, you want more air. You want to be able to take deeper, faster breaths, so you dilate or increase the diameter of your bronchioles in your lung. And also, if you have asthma, you can use a beta activator, and so it's a drug. It'll attach to specifically the beta 2 receptor for asthmatics, and it will open up their lung tubes. In other words, dilate their lung bronchioles. Over-the-counter drugs for colds, allergies, nasal congestion, they're all sympathetic mimicking drugs, and all these over-the-counter drugs will stimulate alpha adrenergic receptors, so you can decrease mucus secretion. And as you know, if you have a cold, allergy, or nasal congestion, you have a lot of mucus secretion. If you want to decrease that, you take a sympathetic mimicking drug. Here's a table that talks about the drug class, the receptor that the drug binds to, its effects, and an example, and then its clinical use. So you can take a look at that. Now this I kind of had to stick in somewhere, these next two slides, because I didn't want to just do a video with 2 slides, but this cartoon shows a homeostatic imbalance of the autonomic nervous system. So let's look at the cartoon first. And I show this cartoon again when I teach 202. But here we have an artery. So it tells you right here, this is an artery. This is the artery cut. And it doesn't show, but all this stuff in here, this kind of light pink stuff, that's all made of vascular smooth muscle cells. And then you can see here's the yellow thing here, that's a sympathetic nerve fiber. So there's an axon coming in, and it's stimulating the smooth muscle cells in the wall of the blood vessel. So the smooth muscle cells are contracting. That means you have a smaller diameter. From here to here, the diameter is small. And then these hashtags here, these lines up here, that's the frequency of action potentials. So in your blood vessels, you have a strong sympathetic tone. That means the vascular smooth muscle cells that live in the wall of the blood vessel are partially contracted and leads to a condition, it's called vasoconstriction. When the action potential frequency decreases, so see how there's fewer action potential hash marks here coming down the sympathetic neuron or axon of the sympathetic neuron, then you have a weaker sympathetic tone. That means these smooth muscle cells relax. When they relax, the blood vessel dilates. That's called vasodilation. Hypertension then, so we're up here, hypertension or high blood pressure is an overactive sympathetic vasoconstrictor response to stress. So if you're under chronic stress or super stressful situation, you can get an overactive sympathetic vasoconstrictor response. So your blood vessels get even smaller and you have a certain amount of volume of blood in your blood vessels. It's going to, if this diameter is smaller, the blood pressure inside the vessel is going to go up. You'll have hypertension. You can treat this by using adrenergic receptor blocking drugs. So if you block the adrenergic receptors on the smooth muscle cells here in the wall of the blood vessel, then the blood vessel can dilate and the blood pressure will go down. There's also a disease called Raynaud's disease where you have exaggerated vasoconstriction in your extremities. So there's increased frequency of action potentials in the sympathetic nerve fiber, and you have an exaggerated or overconstriction of your blood vessels. And the phenotype is you are pale because you're not getting the blood flow that you should because your blood vessels have a decreased diameter. Then you go cyanotic, so that's kind of a cyan or purple color, and it's a very painful disease, but you can treat it with vasodilators. Just open up the blood vessels or increase the diameter of the blood vessels. And then finally, developmental aspects of the autonomic nervous system. So it's kind of a cool cartoon. So on the left side is the sympathetic, right side is the parasympathetic nervous system, and it kind of just shows here, let's just look at a couple. On the sympathetic side, so you have the preganglionic neuron here, synapsing with the postganglionic neuron in a ganglia. Postganglionic neuron travels out to the eye, and in a sympathetic nervous system situation, your pupil's going to dilate. More light comes in. You're in a fight situation. You want more light. You want more information about the environment. You're about to fight or run away or freeze. In the parasympathetic nervous system, you can see here's the preganglionic neuron coming out of the brainstem. Preganglionic neuron travels to the ganglia, synapses with a postganglionic neuron that goes to the eye, and it constricts your pupil. So if you're in a parasympathetic nervous system situation, you're resting, you're digesting, and you don't need as much light to assess your environment. And then you can look through all these other parts of this cartoon. It's kind of interesting, gives some fun cartoons and fun detail. But there are effects of age on the autonomic nervous system. So for example, down here, the autonomic nervous system innervates your rectum in this parasympathetic and sympathetic. So as you get older, the autonomic nervous system doesn't function as well. You can be constipated. You can have dry eyes. So that'd be your lacrimal gland. And you can get actually frequent eye infections because your eyes are dry. And the tears aren't washing away the bacteria in your eye. You can also have a condition called orthostatic hypotension. That means you have low blood pressure when you change your body position. And that's an effect of the autonomic nervous system getting older. And specifically, orthostatic hypotension is due to a slowed response by the sympathetic vasoconstrictor centers. So that's the vasoconstrictors, vasodilators. When you vasodilate, remember your blood vessels generally get bigger. When you vasoconstrict, your blood vessels get smaller. So if that system is not working well, then you can get really low blood pressure, orthostatic hypotension, as opposed to hypertension. And this condition happens as you get older. I had a fireman friend told me that when he goes out to assess a situation as an EMT and a fireman, that, what did he tell me, like, if you're over 50, it's like 60, or maybe it's over 60, something like 50% or 60% of the people will have some form, it could be mild, of orthostatic hypotension. So hypertension versus hypotension. And I believe that's the last slide.